TV can be entertainment or escape. It can be informational. It can also, like literature or film, be a way of exploring worlds outside of our own. In the past couple decades, the medium has been getting a little bit more respect, largely due to an influx in male-oriented programming and our culture's tendency to view the contributions of men, particularly white men, as deserving of respect. However, women have always been at the forefront of the genre. I'm going to talk about just a few of these women today: Gertrude Berg, Mary Tyler Moore, and Shonda Rhimes. The first of these women was Gertrude Berg, who in the late 1940s had the foresight to predict that TV was going to be the future of broadcasting and insisted that CBS let her adopt her popular radio program, The Goldbergs, for TV. Despite the fact that the Goldbergs had been a big part of keeping CBS afloat during the Depression, she still had a couple difficulties in negotiating her deal. A couple of these issues were the uncertainty of TV's viability as a medium and the relative expense of producing a television sitcom. Something else that might have been a factor in CBS's hesitancy was that Berg was Jewish and her show depicted a Jewish American immigrant family. But while this was a deterrent to the network, a lot of Jewish Americans expressed their appreciation at seeing people like themselves represented on television. And it also, in the words of Jennifer Keeshan Armstrong in her book When Women Invented Television, brought Jewish immigrant culture to millions of Gentiles across the United States, helping to erode some people's anti-Semitic sentiments. After a successful broadcast episode in 1948, CBS picked up the show and it began its several season run in January of 1949. Over the next decade, TV became a more established medium and women's roles behind the scenes, positions behind the scenes, began to wane, and female characters remained constrained to housewife tropes. Mary Tyler Moore was instrumental in changing this in the mid to late 20th century, both with her acting roles and her production company. Her first major television role was as Laura Petrie on The Dick Van Dyke Show, who slightly but perceptibly moved forward the role of the television housewife. If you know much about Laura Petrie, you probably know that it was a pretty big deal in the early 1960s that she was the first woman to regularly be shown wearing pants on TV. This costuming choice served as a visual representation of other ways in which Laura was a more progressive role than many of her predecessors and contemporaries. She can be contrasted for comparison with Lucy Ricardo of I Love Lucy, who pursued her show business ambitions pretty ineptly and without her husband's permission. Laura, on the other hand, had viable career options in multiple episodes. And while she does remain a housewife each time, this is decidedly portrayed as her choice, not something her husband is forcing on her. Moore's next major role was as Mary Richards on The Mary Tyler Moore Show. This role was revolutionary. She was a single woman in her 30s who wasn't really focused on finding a husband. The show does have plot lines about her love life, but it centers on her workplace and her friendships, including with several other well-developed female characters. The show is also influential to TV generally in helping to popularize the workplace sitcom as opposed to the family sitcom that had dominated the genre in the 50s and 60s. Moore also founded a production company with her husband, MTM Enterprises, which produced many popular sitcoms, including The Mary Tyler Moore Show and its spin-offs, Rhoda and Phyllis. Finally, I'm going to talk about one of the most influential and prolific TV makers of this century, Shonda Rhimes. Starting with Grey's Anatomy, which first aired in 2005, Rhimes has produced many of the most popular dramas of the past 20 years, which often deal with current social issues. Grey's Anatomy, for example, had bisexual characters and gay relationships in the mid-2000s, sorry, not early, which wasn't very common on shows that weren't specifically like about gay characters and issues. It also had major characters of color all along, but when Rhimes created Scandal in 2012, Olivia Pope became the first Black female protagonist on an American drama since 1974. Just 2 years later, Rhimes's production company repeated this with How to Get Away with Murder. Now, while diverse racial representation has always been crucial to Rhimes's shows, she doesn't usually put social issues at the forefront of their premises. Scandal, for example, barely makes explicit mention of racism for its first few seasons until a season 4 episode in which Pope is hired to represent the police in the fatal shooting of a Black boy. She eventually walks away from the police who have hired her and joins those protesting the shooting. If Scandal had always addressed racism head on, it would have primarily appealed to people who are already interested in those issues. However, by not advertising itself as a show about social issues, it appealed to a broader base of viewers and was able to expose people to ideas that they might not otherwise have educated themselves on. These are just a few of the many, many women who have shaped television over the past 70 plus years. Others include Oprah Winfrey, Ellen DeGeneres, Jenji Cohen, and so many more than I could possibly mention right now. All of these women, but especially the women of color and those who are not straight and cisgendered, have fought uphill battles in achieving their positions and used them not just to create great television, but to represent a better and more progressive world.